All right, now we're ready to go. So again, welcome Dr. Bob Weber. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Weber, and if you need anything, please let me know.
Will do. Excuse me. Thanks, Brett. Appreciate the opportunity to be on with your membership and staff that have joined us today, and really look forward to kind of a peek under the hood, if you will, of the revisions that we've made to the Terminal Sire Index. And we'll kind of work through a series of steps that detail that work and the approach that we took. Appreciate the number of familiar faces and names online. So I see my next county over neighbors, the Finks, are on. So hi, Galen and Lori, and Christian Rennert. Good to see you again, buddy. It's been a while. So thanks everybody for joining. If I haven't met you in person and we happen to cross paths somewhere, please do take the opportunity to introduce yourself, and we'll look forward to, I'm always good for a good philosophical conversation or two, and look forward to that moving forward. So a little bit of background here. Several of you are obviously familiar with me, but just a real quick introduction. I'm a faculty member here at Kansas State University. I've been here since 2011. My current role is serving in a department head capacity, overseeing off-campus research and extension centers in the eastern half of the state. So I've got all the mission areas at the university in our extension program. So I've got youth development, family consumer science, horticulture, agronomy, and fortunately a fair bit of livestock work, including one center that's got a fairly sizable research feed yard down in southeast Kansas. Had a long engagement with the Beef Improvement Federation going back clear into the mid-1990s, where I worked at the American Gelbvieh Association and later with American Simmental. Served as a board rep, and then later Central Region Secretary and current Executive Director for BIF. If you've not been to a BIF meeting, I would encourage you to come. I know Christian came, he was actually on one of our panels this summer. A really fantastic learning opportunity, and I chalk it up as, for cow-calf and seed stock producers, a really important piece of professional development. So I'll put in a little plug for BIF. Our next meeting's in Amarillo, so relatively centrally located, early July of 2025. Look forward to seeing many of you there. Although I do serve in an administrative role principally here at the university, I'm still deeply engaged with our animal breeding and genetics group and participate in our research activities around principally beef cattle genetic improvement. We've got a little bit of sheep and goat work going as well, but mostly in the beef cattle space. In fact, we had a student defend yesterday afternoon on some male fertility work that our group has undertaken, and that work's led by Dr. Megan Rolfe, and she's kind of our main research faculty in breeding and genetics. Academically, background PhD in animal breeding with John Pollock at Cornell University in the early 2000s. And as I mentioned, a couple of breed spots before that. My family, my wife and I both grew up in the Hereford business, so we've got a few Hereford cows. And there's one Charolais around. I had a picture in the other day for abbreviation, took it out, but our families like showing cattle and being engaged in that activity, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here in eastern Kansas, where there's plenty of that to do. So enough about me. Let's talk about selection index. So selection index is a topic that you'll find I get really excited about. I think as both an extension educator and former breed staff, one of the biggest challenges we have in working in selection in the beef space is making sense of all of the EPDs and data that we push out at our commercial customers. And certainly back when I started at the Gelbvieh Association, we had calving ease was a relatively new trait, but birth weaning, yearling milk, a little bit of carcass development right at the end of that period, that was it. Now most breeds have a dozen or a dozen and a half EPDs and indexes, providing good advice to customers about how to make selection and what things are important is not a simple task. And selection index is a tool that helps us contextualize our EPDs. It helps commercial cattlemen make more simplified and I think much more efficient and accurate selection decisions because of the way they're constructed and the economic relevance that they bring to their breeding decisions. So we can think about really Terminal Sire Index or other selection indexes really as an individual value that summarizes and appropriately weights the importance of underlying traits that contribute to profit to a certain endpoint. So it's a summary of EPDs essentially. And again, it appropriately weights each trait for its importance and contribution to profit. And that's really, I think, the essence of the utility of selection index and why it's such a powerful tool for our commercial producers, because it focuses the decision on the traits that really are important to that endpoint and obfuscates or removes the ones that aren't relevant to that particular selection decision. And so it takes some of the confusion out, if you will, from the index or the selection process. The challenge sometimes is it's a little bit of a black box if you're not kind of familiar with index construction. And so one of our goals that Brett and I talked about for today's webinar was really to take that peek under the hood and build more understanding about selection index and how it works. So as you go interact with commercial producers and other seed stock breeders, that you've got that knowledge and can speak with confidence about the importance and utility of selection index tools. It's not a new idea. Selection index actually was proposed in the early 1940s by a graduate student at Iowa State University. Was deployed in pork and poultry businesses in the 1950s and early 60s, and then not in the beef business until the innovative work done at AICA in the early 2000s with Dr. William Herring, who was my predecessor at the University of Missouri, did the early development work for TSI. And I think really helped pioneer the development and implementation of selection index for the beef industry. And certainly we're more complicated as a business than pork and poultry because of our diverse ownership. But there's certainly a lot of robustness around the utility of selection index. And generalized indexes like TSI that we're going to talk about today, even if you've got some pretty substantial departures from the assumptions in the model, still do a really good job of ranking the bulls for selection in the system. Certainly, we can do a better job customizing indexes in some cases where you have those very divergent economic assumptions that are violated. But as a tool, generalized indexes have become a very relevant currency of the realm, if you will, and wide application in our business. And TSI has been out for a long time. It's been updated a couple of times along the way. But I think, Brett, our research said maybe 2016, 2017 was the last big overhaul on the economic assumptions. And we know in our business, lots has changed since 2016, 2017 in terms of both market pricing, input costs, particularly on the cow-calf side, and certainly the change in emphasis towards much higher grading cattle in the beef chain and emphasis on quality grade. And so those changes in economic parameters really motivate an update for TSI. Oftentimes I get questions about, selection index is really complicated, da, 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 da. Well, it is in some ways. But in application, it's actually a very simple method in computation. So at the bottom of the equation, or the bottom of the screen, is a simple equation that's really the calculation of the index. And it's simply the weighting of EPDs, so EPD 1 to the N are the various traits that are of importance to the selection index. Or to the marketing endpoint rather, and the A sub 1 or 2 or to N are the economic weights that we apply to those EPDs. The complexity in selection index then comes not from this simple equation where we multiply and add. It's in calculating what those economic weights are. And there's a variety of methods to do that. We're going to talk about bioeconomic simulation using software and modeling to come up with those. But certainly there's other methods that we might use in terms of writing out a profit equation, say for the beef business, and then doing some calculus on that to get the economic weights. One of the key components of the index, though, is the idea that we connect traits that we have available for selection. So the traits in the selection index, we also call those the selection criteria. So they're the underlying EPDs that are economically related to the profit endpoint for our scenario. Back to characteristics or traits that we would think about that are actually in our, what we as animal breeders call the breeding objective. And they're the components of the bioeconomic model that are directly tied to economically relevant traits or ones that have cost or revenue directly tied to them. And so you can look through this list, and you're familiar, everybody, with the items on the left side. So these are the common EPDs we have available across our business. The right-hand side then represents the things that have, from a production standpoint, costs or revenues tied with them. So things like calf survival or weaning weight, male or female fertility, longevity, milk production, feed efficiency. One of the real powers of selection index is that it uses traits that maybe are directly tied to an ERT. So if we were, say, a weaning endpoint model, weaning weight would be an ERT. But in a terminal index, where we slaughter animals at slaughter harvest time, but at the end of the feeding phase, into the chain, weaning weight's not really an ERT. We don't collect a paycheck partway along the way. We're retaining ownership, but it's an indicator trait, and it's tied to differences in profitability and performance of the animal along the way. And the beauty of selection index is that it gets to tie together through the set of genetic relationships amongst traits those various components as we calculate and formulate the economic weights for the index. If you're really getting like excited about the idea of selection index, I'm happy to point you to a number of talks at various BIF meetings or industry meetings that go into more detail here. But for today, we'll kind of leave it at a 30,000-foot view of the operation of the index. But wanted to make sure we shared some of that. I mentioned the bioeconomic model as the approach that we use to update TSI. And a number of years ago, Dr. Matt Spangler led a USDA-funded project to combine a series of tools that were available, what they called partial solutions, to combine those together to make a decision support tool for the beef industry. And that product is called iGenDec. It's a web platform. It's at the end of the project was needed to find a home, otherwise it got shelved. And so the Beef Improvement Federation, recognizing the importance of a development platform like this for breed associations and other industry participants to use to develop and revise selection indexes, took on the responsibility of building out a web server and hosting this particular platform. And what iGenDec does is behind the scenes creates a model of a cow herd, actually, depending on which component you're in, 10 or 20 different cow herds, and models them through a planning horizon. So in the model, you get to specify what your planning horizon is. For this, we used 20 years. So it models about 10 herds for 20 years and creates thousands of simulated progeny and replicates of those 10 herds to evaluate what is the impact of genetic change on profit. And so one of the interpretations of the economic weights that we apply to the EPDs is what is the contribution to profit for a 1-unit change in the trait, all other traits held constant. And so it provides that marginal return to profit. So taking into account the cost to get there for each change in a trait that's of economic importance to the index. And so as you select into building one of these indexes in iGenDec, it asks what your marketing endpoint is. It asks if it's a terminal system or if you plan to keep replacement females. Asks you lots of questions about breeds and breed composition. So it models the heterosis effects, the breed differences from the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center data. There's a whole lot of background information that's built into iGenDec to build out these simulations. Some of you may ask, well, does it work? We've had some recent interaction with a large seed stock producer that there's actually a beef on dairy component built into iGenDec as well. And that particular enterprise feeds a couple 100,000 head of feeder cattle through clear to harvest. And so they used iGenDec to build their own selection index to use beef bulls on dairy cows. And then they took the carcass and feeding information from the progeny that were slaughtered, standardized the pricing grid so they didn't have to deal with seasonality and some other adjustments for pricing. So they were priced all on a constant basis based on quality grade, yield grade, and carcass weight. And then ran an analysis back against the model predicted index values for those sires and looked at the relationship between the index value for a bull and its progeny's average performance. And the correlation of those numbers were on top of 0.9. And they hypothesized they didn't have individual feed intake differences on the progeny, but they did have feed intake data on the bulls that were included. So they were 90% without the feed intake component characterized in the fed cattle side. So they were really happy. Obviously, as academics, when we get that kind of report, we're pretty excited as well. So iGenDec does a really good job modeling the production system and gives us confidence that our predictions relative to differences in profit should be very effective in the business. So as we talk about the scenario that we modeled in iGenDec, that particular scenario is taking Charolais bulls and mating them to Angus cows, commercial Angus cows that are 2 to 10 years of age. So we didn't use a first calf heifer mating in this. We assumed that they were going to be mated to some kind of calving ease bull. And then cows for their second parity and on would be terminally mated. So there's no emphasis on maternal traits. So that's a really key component here is this is exclusively focused on market outputs. So we're going to slaughter all the steers and heifers that are produced from these breeding decisions. They're fed as yearlings and to relatively heavy outweights. We'll talk about some of the phenotypic performance data that was used, but they're to pretty heavy outweights, which is typical of today's market space. And they're marketed on a value-based grid that rewards differences in both quality grade and yield grade, including a premium for the upper 2/3 of choice. Okay. The goal of the index then is designed to aid commercial cattlemen in making the most efficient economic-based selection decision to that terminal endpoint that maximizes profitability per conception. It's important to note here that TSI is not what is animal breeders we might call a desired gains index or one that's designed to guide an individual seed stock operator to make directional change in their operation. It is really designed as a tool for commercial cattlemen and to influence their purchase decision. Now, that doesn't mean that the index isn't useful for seed stock breeders. I know when I was purebred unit coordinator, we paid a lot of attention to the index values from the various breed groups that we worked in because we knew our customers did, right? So we were trying to breed cattle that worked into those index scenarios. But we placed slightly different emphasis on traits where we had holes, if you will, or needed to make more improvement than what the index might have guided us to make sure the product that came to our customer fit their needs. So, TSI can be useful in these seed stock spaces, but I think primarily as a way to look at what's our product look like that's going out into the commercial space and recognize that using it alone to make selection decisions may not move as fast as you might want to move in particular traits within your herd. Because again, it's commercial focus, okay? The pricing data that was used in the system, and I should say as we built this out, one of the things I think is really important is that we use as much publicly citable data as possible and information. What we don't want is somebody going, well, you put some number in there that's not real, right? Well, real is important, and real helps us forecast and make breeding decisions into the future that are more reliable. And so we've used a lot of data out of the public space. So the pricing information comes out of USDA reported data. It's a 10-year time series. Weekly reported, in this case, fed steer beef prices and carcass premiums and discounts reported weekly. I think that's a really important bit that we use, reliable and publicly accessible data. The cattle performance bits come out of the crossbreed research at the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center, which Charolais is one of the populations that's continually sampled as one of the major U.S. beef breeds into that. Usually annually, they come out with a report that both produces the crossbreed EPD adjustments, but also puts out a set of predicted breed of sire mean progeny performances for animals reared in an environment like Clay Center. And so we use that as a citable source to typify the performance of Charolais sired calves in an industry scenario. Okay. The feedlot data is a summary from, this was actually some of the harder data to come by. There's not too many sources of this kind of information about commercial cattle feeding reported in the public literature. So we use the K-State Focus on Feedlot, which summarizes data out of a number of large commercial feed yards in Southwest Kansas. And that's a 10-year average as well. Okay. Let's get to the next bit here. So the feeding system looked like backgrounding, about 150 days of backgrounding. Again, I mentioned these cattle are fed as yearlings. And then about 170 days on feed, which aligns exactly with the K-State Focus on Feedlot data. Feedlot cost of gains 13 cents a pound for feed. That's about a $260 a ton delivered feed cost. Average daily gain out of the Focus on Feedlot is 3.6. Feed conversion ratio is 6:1. Daily dry matter intake on a dry matter basis is 22 pounds roughly. That comes out to a $92 cost of gain. And I'm kind of a feed conversion guy mentally. That's just always the way we talk about feed conversion. But if you're a feed efficiency person, that's a reciprocal. That's 0.16 on a feed efficiency scaling. Okay. Carcass parameters and other performance data here that we modeled, hot carcass weights, average 902. Okay, so these I mentioned earlier, we fed them to a pretty heavy endpoint. This is certainly in line with current industry expectations of feeding performance. Ribeye area 14.6, 12th rib fatness about 4700ths. Marbling score, we used 5.32. And so I'll explain the scaling just a little bit. We use the scale here that's small 0. So the break between the choice and select grades is small 0. That's called 5.00. Okay. So a 532 is 1/3 the way through the small marbling scale, which small marbling is the bottom 1/3 of choice. Okay. And that's out of the Clay Center data. I know some of the carcass data you may be familiar with actually gets scored on a USDA scaling where small 0 is 4.00. So the breed associations adopted this scale a long time ago. It's a whole story by itself. But the iGen Deck one uses the one that we calculate the EPDs on. So it's a 5.0. Birth weight average 89.4 pounds, winning weight 542, and yearling 842. Okay, so one of the things we do is we parameterize the phenotypes. And then I go through and make sure that the parameters and the gain across the model lines up. So if we say they're going to gain 3.6 a day, that the feeding period duration comes out to a live weight that I can relate back with a typical dressing percent to get to carcass weight. So we double check all the math to make sure that the model performs the way we think it should. Okay. Beef prices, so we use the USDA average weekly weighted 5-area dressed beef price over that 10-year time frame. Carcasses under 600 pounds are $20 back of those over 6, and the 6 and above carcasses average 206. 62 or 63, depending on your steers or heifers over that 10-year time frame. And I know many of you are going, well, that's not today's beef price, right? But this is a 10-year average, right? So one of the things that's really important to recognize in our beef space is you can't outrun the market and you can't outbreed the market, right? Our generation interval is long enough that by the time we make a breeding decision, inseminate cows, or our bulls breed cows and we feed the calves, we're 3 years down the road. It's pretty hard to forecast that. The best thing is to look at the previous 10 years, unless you're a way better forecaster than I am. And I've got a twin brother that's in that space. He's like, yeah, just look backwards. It's fine. Capturing the high and low in the cycle that's immediately before you provides us some really good guidelines to work in for our breeding decision moving forward. And I've monkeyed around a little bit with this and put in substantially different market prices. And it moves the index values around, but it doesn't change the rank of the bulls very much. The best bulls are typically going to be the best bulls. They may change order just a little bit, but they don't go from the top of the breed to the bottom of the breed when you do that kind of stuff. So pricing robustness here is pretty good. Yield grade, quality grade grid. Again, this is USDA reported data. Nationally reported premium discount schedule. Prime ones are up about $21.75. Par money's choice yield grade 3. You can see pretty substantial discounts in here for, the choice select spreads about $13. Standards are back from that choice select spread another 15 or 16 bucks. And you'll see as you look at that, quality grade is rewarded differently, substantially differently than yield grade is. And I think that's one of the big changes. If you go back into the early 2000s or even the 2010s, we were working in a choice select spread that was about half of this. And so moving forward, quality continues to drive consumers to our business, and adding emphasis on quality grade here. And you'll see in some of the correlation, we've added some pressure to marbling as well. Okay? I want to share the next bit's really the outputs, and spend some time talking about interpretation of these. There's some nuance to it, I guess, is maybe the best way to describe it. And I want to make sure you get a clear picture of what I'm telling you. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is relative emphasis. Okay. And so I think it's useful when you look at one of these indexes to understand what are the drivers of the index, what traits really influence differences in profit. And we need to make sure that obviously those kind of make sense to us from a industry experience standpoint. And this is where, working in a system where we've got, a lot of people looking at it. So, there was a team of people around this TSI review and development that have experience across multiple sectors of the business to kind of look at it and go, yeah, that makes sense. And you'll see this one makes, I think, a lot of sense when we start to boil it down. But the relative emphasis values then are, again, they're reported in percentage values, and they describe the proportion of variation that each of these EPDs or traits describes in the variation of profit or the variation in the index. Okay, so it's a proportion exercise. And again, they assist in determination of the big drivers. The key thing here at the bottom is that they are not the economic weights, right? So we don't take an EPD and multiply it by this economic or relative emphasis value to get the index. That's not what we do. Okay, this is just telling us once we've weighted the EPDs, what proportion of variation do they account for? So the product of the EPD and the weight, what does it account for in the index? Okay, so here's the visual, if you will, for those relative emphasis values. And so the traits that are in the index include carcass weight, ribeye area, fat thickness, marbling score, dry matter intake, calving ease direct, and post-weaning gain. Okay. Many of you may go, wait a second, we don't have an EPD for feed intake. Okay. That is true, you do not. And there's an emphasis, I think, to be made here that feed intake is a really important trait, and I would encourage your breeders or you as a group of breeders to continue to pursue that and collect additional data for dry matter intake. Not surprising, feed cost is a major component of profitability to animals in the feeding and terminal system. And so what we did to make sure we could include and sort of future-proof, if you will, a little bit of our TSI development work is we included feed intake in our modeling, or dry matter intake. And then to compute the index, we calculate a genetic regression on yearling weight. So we have, I used information actually out of iGenDec to figure out what is the genetic relationship between yearling weight and dry matter intake. And so we calculate a predicted feed intake value based on yearling performance, because we know that growth and intake are strongly genetically associated, and we should account for differences in performance because they have differences in cost. Okay, and so we did that. The resulting predicted feed intake values that we use in Charolais have about half of the range of values of what I see in other breeds that have dry matter intake EPD. So we're being fairly conservative in our assessment here, but we wanted to make sure that we included that as a trait because it is an important cost component, and differentially account for those differences in cost based on performance. So what you see, and I think many of you will agree that have been around the feeding space for a while, this makes a fair bit of sense, right? Hot carcass weight is the principal thing that drives the paycheck. That paycheck is adjusted by quality and yield grade values, right? And so we don't model yield grade directly in iGenDec. We model the components of yield grade. So fat thickness and ribeye area play a role. Some of you may go, well, boy, ribeye area I always thought was really important. It is, and it's important to the extent that it's different than sort of breed average, if you will, right? So we know that the main contribution of ribeye area to profit is actually development of additional carcass weight, and that as carcasses get heavier, they have to grow in ribeye area to maintain yield grade or cutability. Deviations then from that expected growth is what moves an animal up or down in yield grade performance. Okay, so a bunch of ribeye area actually gets soaked up by carcass weight. Fat thickness obviously plays a big role in this particular model, and primarily I think if we went and modeled Charolais bulls on Charolais cows, this index looks different, right? Because the core competencies and the breed strengths of Charolais are different than Angus. And so one of the things that Charolais brings to that mating decision is carcass muscularity and leanness and carcass weight. And certainly being able to control fat thicknesses and yield grade 4s and 5s in this particular production scenario is important, and Charolais brings that, and that's why we emphasize, or the model emphasizes fat thickness as much as it does. Marbling score is also obviously an important determinant, and this is one of the spots where, again, if we were a Charolais mating, would be different, right? But in this case, we actually expect the Angus cow that these bulls are mated to bring quality grade with her as one of the traits that Angus excel in, and so that takes a little bit of the heat off of Charolais bulls from a marbling standpoint, but it's still very, very important in the index. Calving ease direct, of course, we're mating 2-year-olds and older. We expect very low dystocia rate. You've got to be pretty far out of bounds on calving ease direct for this to impact you much. Okay. Post-weaning gains also included in the index to recognize the value of feed efficiency and performance of those animals through the post-weaning phase into the feeding phase. Okay. The next part we're going to shift to is the actual weightings that we apply to the EPDs. So a little different view than the relative emphasis. And these values are what we apply to the EPDs to calculate the index. And what they represent then is a change in net revenue or profit from a 1-unit increase in the selection criteria or the EPD trait, all others held constant. So how much additional profit do I expect if I increase carcass weight 1 pound, holding all the other traits constant? Or how much additional profit do I get if I increase marbling score 1 whole marbling unit, marbling, not degrees, but a whole marbling grade? How much more profit do I generate? Okay, that's what these describe. The important bit here is underlying the calculation, then we've modeled the heritability of the trait, the genetic association between the traits. So we get how much opportunity is there for improvement in those particular traits and the relationships across them. Their economic contribution to profit. You'll notice when I show you the MEVs, birth weight's not in there, milk EPD's not in there, maternal calving ease. Those aren't appropriate EPDs in the context of the terminal index, so they're not included. Effectively, their economic weights are zeros, okay? The other important bit here is that it captures efficiencies, and it calculates or captures those efficiencies through the bioeconomic simulation, the changes in the input-output relationship. So when we calculate an efficiency, we're expressing the differences in input-output relationships. Those get modeled intrinsically in the model, so we don't have to calculate them separately, but they are captured in this bioeconomic exercise. Okay. So here are the MEVs. So if we increase hot carcass weight, so the Ds at the end indicate from iGenDec, these are the direct components of those genetic traits. The units there, the units of measurement, obviously, and then the MEVs are the last column. So as we increase hot carcass weight 1 pound, held everything else constant, we got $1.65 additional profit. Okay. Ribeye area, if we increase the square inch, we got $22.71. Fat thickness, if we had a whole inch of fat thickness, so if we went from our predicted breed mean of 0.47 to 1.47, that costs us $157.89. It's a whole inch increase in fat. Okay. Marbling score, it's in degrees. This would be for 100 degrees or 1 unit's $43. Post-weaning gain, not as valuable in this particular construct. Remember, weaning weight and yearling weight aren't market endpoints in a retained ownership model, but they do get weighted here. The post-weaning gain component, 25 cents. Feed intake. So if we add 1 pound of dry matter intake per day to the animal during the feeding period, that costs us $20.70 negative, right? So it's a cost in the system. So increased dry matter intake results in decreased index value. Okay. Calving ease direct, so that's in percent unassisted. We go up 1 calving ease unit, we only get 94 cents. Again, we don't really expect any dystocia. It's modeled at 1%, just so we've got it in there, but really expect low dystocia rates. One of the things we did have to do in the model, as I mentioned, we weighted post-weaning gain. The index actually weights, or iGenDec calculates the economic weights for weaning weight and yearling weight. It doesn't model post-weaning gain as a construct separately. And so the way we compute the economic weight is we take the difference between those values. So if you take the negative 0.1 and subtract off negative 0.35, that gives us 25 cents. Some of you are probably going, wait, what? Why do we do a negative economic weight on weaning weight and yearling weight? Well, one of the ways to think about this is that, relative to carcass weight, we know that weaning weight and yearling weight are less valuable on a per pound basis anyway. And the other bit is it's looking at the relationship between the cost of gain pre-weaning in the post-weaning period and then on feed to harvest. Okay. And what it says is that if you're going to retain ownership, your cost ahead to put on weight gain either in the backgrounding period or in the feeding period versus weaning weight. Okay. Which makes sense, right? We know cow costs are like crazy right now anyway. We model them, the feed cost component and variable cost about just short of $600. If we put in depreciation, land cost, replacement females, all that stuff, that number's over 1,000 really fast. But the model says from a feeding perspective, there's opportunity cost associated with weaning weight and yearling weight, and that don't put a lot of positive pressure on those traits. One of the things that I'm confident of is as you select for hot carcass weight, we're going to drag weaning weight and yearling weight along with it, right? Those traits are strongly genetically correlated. They provide opportunities for improvements in efficiency and gain through the feedlot. So this transpose or presentation of post-weaning gain versus weaning weight and yearling weight, I think is a really sensible construct to communicate that improvement in value during that post-weaning phase. Okay. So in the calculation, then our post-weaning gain replaces the MEVs for weaning weight and yearling weight. Okay. So just real quick here as we kind of wrap up the presentation part, and I do look forward to some questions and discussion around the new TSI as we wrap up the webinar. But here's the relationship between the existing TSI calculation. So each dot on here represents a bull. There's about 5,000 or 4,400 bulls that I pulled out of the database from the US and Canada, calculated that had TSI and the existing TSI, and then calculated the new TSI value. And again, it's not base adjusted. So the ones that come out in the published, we've base adjusted. So the scales are about the same. But what I was looking at is how good is the linear relationship between the old and the new. And it's really good, right? The best bulls tend to be kind of towards the top of the list. The poorer bulls towards the bottom of the list. We've maintained much of that rank, even though we've changed the economic parameters a fair bit. So I think one way to think about this is more of a tweak than an overhaul, right? The bulls that excel in growth and carcass merit are going to be towards the top of the list. Okay. Here's the distribution. Again, these are the unweighted TSI values. I mostly put this together to illustrate two things. One, we expect a normal distribution for these values based on the EPDs that went in them, and also to illustrate, the spread. We've got bulls that are, about minus 35 on the unweighted base or unscaled base, up to about 150. So there's about 180 pound or $180 difference from top to bottom in that list, which is fairly similar to your existing TSI values. Here's another way to kind of look at things. This is a set of correlations between the computed selection index values for the existing and updated TSI and the EPDs of bulls. So this isn't the genetic correlation, it's just the association between the index and the bull's EPDs, okay? But what we find is, feed intake, so this BFI value, the green ones are the ones that are in the index. BFI is correlated about 0.77 with the updated TSI. Interestingly, about 0.96 with the old one, right? So the old TSI index was very heavily weighted on growth and less emphasis on some of the carcass traits. Calving ease direct, it's a little more weight in our TSI. The old index had birth weight in it and not calving ease, so we've changed the focus a little bit there. But calving ease direct is the ERT. Post-weaning gain, you can see gain again, or growth was really heavily weighted in the old TSI. New one, those correlations are about 0.65. Carcass weight, again, alignment of the ERTs, right? So the old TSI included birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, effectively post-weaning gain, and differences in yield and a little bit of marbling performance. iGenDec allows us to go back around and actually model the carcass end point for quality grade, cutability or yield grade and carcass weight. And so we see, a little stronger alignment in a couple of these, so carcass weight, ribeye area, and a little more emphasis on marbling. So with that, I'm glad to answer any questions that you might have. Look forward to a little bit of dialogue, and I'll offer up to Brett, afterwards, if somebody comes up with a question, relay those along. I'm glad to handle them: phone, text, email. Galen, I suppose maybe a site visit to your place. I don't know. You're not far away, so.
Well, thank you, Dr. Weber. I do want to make sure we take ample time for questions here, but I certainly appreciate your time today and appreciate the work you put in. So certainly open it up now for anyone to have questions, comments, thoughts on this.
I didn't do that good a job. There's got to be some questions out there.
Hey, Bob, how soon does this roll out? When will we see it on the pedigrees?
Great question, Lori. I will actually pass that to Brett. I know we've talked about it, but I don't remember the exact date we planned for the rollover. So
This will come out on the next month's evaluation. So the October 1st evaluation.
October 1st. Yep. So we're like in a few days.
Correct. Yep.
Very good.
Hi, Lori.
Hello. I'm sorry, Bob. Galen couldn't be here today because it's the K-State Stalker Conference down on campus, and he's
Oh, that's right.
attending that.
Soccer day is today. I had that on my
Yes.
calendar, and
So
with this and a couple other things, I didn't make it. So yeah.
can't be two places at once. Of course, he doesn't know where the on button on the computer is anyways.
Well,
Not even here to
you can
defend.
replay it for him some evening, and he can have a cup of
Yeah.
coffee.
I will.
If he's got insomnia, this will probably fix it. So.
Bob, this is Bob Wagner. I just have a quick question, something I didn't understand. You
Sure.
indicated in the last slide that the spread in the change in the EPD is about 100 and the TSI is about 180. Doesn't that mean that if that's true, doesn't that mean that the actual change in TSIs will be that change plus the sum of the changes that currently exist in the TSI? So it'll be a huge difference between the top and the bottom, or do I misunderstand?
No, yeah, so the number I described is what the expected range is from top to bottom. It's about $180. Okay, so this isn't the change in TSI. This is just the unadjusted values for TSI, the updated version. And my point was that the range you see in the values in the updated TSI is about the same as the range that we had in old TSI. Yep.
Because so the graph that you showed with the changes in it, that I guess I was confused because it looked like the changes encompassed a range of about 180, but that's not true.
Let me share the slide again.
This is the one I'm talking about.
Yep. Yeah, so this isn't change in TSI. This is the TSI, the updated TSI values.
But the updated TSI values are already much different than the numbers you have on your x-axis.
Without a base adjustment, though.
This is without the base adjustment. So
Yeah.
we're going to
Okay.
scale these
We've always
up.
adjusted the base so we don't go negative on any animals. And so that go ahead, Bob. I shouldn't be jumping in too much.
No, that's all right. Yeah, so Bob, the mean here is about right at 50. Okay, and that's just as it came out of the index computation. What we're going to do for deployment is actually base adjust these. So we're going to add a constant value to everybody's TSI value to get it so that the mean of the new TSI is about the same as the old TSI mean, right? So if you're used to looking at bulls, you want bulls that are 300. Okay, you'll be able to use the new TSI with the same kind of cutoff. Okay,
Thank you.
does that make sense?
A little more, yes.
Okay.
Good question. We've got Breed Improvement Chair Jim Johnson on as well. Don't know, Jim, if you've got any additional thoughts to share as you've been a part of this process as well.
No, I'd just say that, we have worked on this pretty much all summer to try to get it as right as possible. I just applaud the group between us and Canada that they kind of worked on this. We met, every couple of weeks and went through several renditions of it to make sure we got it right. And that's why the plan was kind of launch it early in the midsummer, but we wanted to make sure it was right. And so we feel pretty strongly about it at this point. Feel pretty good about it. So hope you all feel the same. Tried to do our due diligence to get this as good a indicator for our commercial customers as we could.
I think it's a good point. And one other point I like to make on these sort of multi-trait indexes is there's a lot of different ways to get to a strong TSI number. And no matter what your breeding philosophies are, no matter what shrinks your cow herd and your breeding program have at home, hopefully this can give you some indication that maybe we have not even had quite as transparent before about some of the different ways that you can utilize those strengths to ultimately get at something that holds a lot of value. But there are a lot of different ways to create, an upper percentile TSI animal or bull in the market. So I think that's very important. I was also, as we went through this whole process, like Jim mentioned, there was a lot of different iterations that we worked through. We took great care. We're really pleased to see a high correlation here between the old with the ability to watch it continue to evolve on into the future. So whether that's the intake component or just understanding that we're going to have a 10-year rolling average on these economic assumptions, we will see some re-ranks in some spots, but as we looked at this as a whole and looked at it as a whole to move forward with over the next 10 years, we are feeling very confident that this is a much more informed tool, a much better tool. Again, to Bob's point, we're making breeding decisions which are creating feeder cattle that the industry's going to see kind of play out over the next 5 years and more. So it's important to us to make sure we're continuing to evolve it, and it does feel like it's certainly stronger than it was, and that was definitely our goal here. We'll see some increased fall data come in as well, on calves and non-parent bulls. And so, obviously this is the time of year where we're going to see some differing things happen in terms of TSI actual rankings. But again, if you're like me, those numbers are important, but breed percentile rankings are more important because we're working within a population of genetics. We're always comparing genetics to other genetics within the population. So really being able to track where cattle lie within a breed percentile ranking keeps us moving in the right direction in terms of population genetics, and not just treating animals as individuals, but truly making progress within our breeding programs that's going to drive the whole industry forward.
Yeah, the other thing I would add, Brett, I just appreciate you and staff. I think the degree of transparency and how this was developed and having Bob on and stuff like that is a compliment to what you guys are doing, and appreciate the level of transparency, and I hope you guys that are on felt that. I don't think we, like Bob said at the beginning, we don't want this to be a black box. We want people to kind of understand how this is developed, and hopefully I think Brett, you can probably discuss what's coming as far as information in the journal and what's going to be available for breeders for their sale catalogs and some of those things as well.
Absolutely. I'll take a minute as anyone's gathering any final questions up. So yes, we'll have a 3-page editorial feature coming out in the October Charolais Journal. Obviously, that's available free online for anyone. You'll certainly, as a member, be seeing it in your mailbox here shortly. We're going to take this recording. We're going to have it on the homepage for the next several months. At some point, it will go off the homepage and onto the TSI page. This recording is going to be available for quite a long time, as well as supporting graphs and supporting information. We want to make sure that that's available. We want to continue to arm field staff with this information, whether it's handouts or the slides that we'll have available for them to go through with breeders as they're making visits and they get into those questions. Obviously, we'll be in social media as well, providing that information for folks at every opportunity for someone that wants to be involved with it. Of course, we'll highlight it at the board meeting, which again, I said this many times in the last few months. It's a rarity to have a board meeting that's open to the membership with a breed organization. And so any members got the ability to step in and also engage with any of these things at a board level, at a decision board level. And certainly we'll recap this as well at the board meeting too. So what Jim also mentioned was a kind of a later breaking thing, which I think is a fantastic idea. And we're going to create a professionally designed one-pager for those of you with production bull sales, a one-page ad, if you will, which would be a great catalog insert. I guess we'll probably make a half page as well. That kind of gives a little bit more understanding of how a bull buyer, a commercial producer can utilize TSI and what they can expect if they're utilizing TSI as part of their selection process. So we'll have that done Should have it done here in just a few days. We'll make that available online as well. So if anyone's got other ideas around outreach, around education, communication, we're here. We always take those. We can't always do it right away, but they do matter to us. Those comments, those ideas, and we'll do our best to put them into play as quickly as possible. Well, everybody's on mute, so I'm going to give one more chance though. If you've got a question, certainly we want to hear it. If you've got a question, someone else has probably had it as well, and so don't be afraid to share that right now, so we can make sure that it's on this recording, and also those of us on this call can hear it. Does anyone have any final questions about the slides or the updates that we've seen here today? Very good. Well, thank you guys for spending your noon hour with us here, and really appreciate you, Bob. Appreciate the work and hard work you've put into this. Again, we're available if you have any questions that surface after the fact. Please let us know, and otherwise, we'll hope you'll continue to spread the word on this, to visit with other breeders. I mean, that's the most powerful communication tool that there is the networking between breeders. So please share this with other breeders. I've been a part of other breed organizations where we had some pretty major shifts, and many times people didn't even realize it quite had happened. And so not all of us live in animal lookup on the AICA website. So by all means, we want to make sure we're communicating that thoroughly. But again, doors open here. Please let us know if there's anything we can do.
Thanks, y'all. Appreciate everybody joining today. Thanks, Brett.
All right. Thank you, guys. Have a great day.